Good evening, viewers, and welcome back to Open Discussion for Women. On today, I will be discussing the topic in which you've already viewed before from the previous clips. Every sacrifice requested is not always required. Throughout this video, you will see me look down and over to my left, your right, and that is because I have study material that I will be utilizing to assist me in this topic discussion. I will be utilizing the English Standard Version of the Bible. The purpose of me bringing this topic discussion to you today is to encourage you. To inform you and to let you know that obedience is far greater than sacrifice. Okay, so let's get started. A brief history of Abraham. Abraham in Genesis, we'll start with the chapters. Starting in the book of Genesis, let's go to the 12th chapter. And the 12th chapter of Genesis is where we learn that Abraham, his name prior to being Abraham was Abram. Abram means exalted father. So Abram was a wealthy man. He had plenty of silver, gold, livestock. You name it, he had it. But Abraham did not have children. And in the 12th book of Genesis, we see Abraham was commanded by God to leave his father's land, which was Hanan. And God made promises to Abraham for his obedience. God promised Abraham that he would be a father of many nations. Now, mind you, currently, Abraham's name is Abram. And that name means exalted father. Okay? So currently, he's already named exalted father. So God informed him, and this was the promise to him in the book of Genesis, that the 12th chapter, that he would be a father of many nations. Now at this time, Abraham was 75 years old when God made him this promise. Now, in order for Abraham to be the father of many nations, he would have to have children. So the brief history I want to leave with you is that he's been promised in the 12th chapter of Genesis. He is named Abram. His name is Abram, which means exalted father or high father. He is wealthy, has plenty of silver and gold according to Genesis 13th chapter, plenty of livestock. He has plenty, except he has no children. So now that we have that established, let's move forward. Now, the promise of Abraham. Just as I stated before, in the 12th chapter of Genesis, God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. And that promise was given to Abraham in the 12th chapter of Genesis for his faithfulness and for his obedience to God, to leaving his father's land, Hanan. And know this, God spoke with him and told him to leave the land and go where he tell him. So at the time, he didn't know where he was going. He just knew that God said go, and he did that. He was obedient. He chose to be obedient to God, and he chose to just go. So moving right along in our outline, we're at Roman numeral 3 now, the sacrifice of Abraham. Now, I want to read over some of my notes just to ensure that I'm giving you all of the information that I have studied. Abraham was asked by God to leave his father's house at the age of 75. His obedience invoked the promises of God, which was that he would be the father of many nations. Now, just as I stated before, in order for Abraham to be the father of many nations, he would have to have sons. Because in order to reproduce, obviously, you would have to have sons. He would have to have offsprings of his own. At this time, he was married to Sarai, and Sarai did not have any children from him. Now, we know that Abraham's wife name was Sarah, but prior to her name being Sarah, her name was Sarai. Sarai means quarrelsome. So just as Abram name changed to Abraham, so did Sarai name change to Sarah. Abram name changed to Abraham, meaning father of the multitude, while Sarah name being Sarai, meaning quarrelsome, God changed to Sarah, meaning princess. So what we're finding here is that not just the sacrifices are important in this lesson, but also the name. But I will stick with the sacrifice because that's what I'm talking to you about today. So, in the 15th chapter of Genesis, Abraham talked with the Lord about his promise. And the Lord reassures him that his heir will be his own son. Because God has promised him now. If you go back to the 12th chapter, he's already made the promise that he would be a father of many nations. However, he is speaking with the Lord now, as we often do. Go to the Lord and say, okay, God, I know that I heard this from you, and I know that this is a promise from you. Now how? Because I don't have any children. And God reassured him in the 15th chapter of Genesis that it will be your own heir, an heir of your own. So if you keep reading down to the 16th chapter, you see that Sarai gets impatient. Now Sarai is Abram's wife, and she also heard the promise of God, and she got a little impatient, and she decided that she wanted to help God out. So what she did was she went to Abram and said, why don't you take one of my servants, Hagar? So she offered her servant Hagar to be joined with intimately her husband Abram. And when she did that, as a result, he bore a child, and that child was named Ishmael. Now, understand this. Sarai heard the promise of God that was given to Abram, and she wanted to do her best to ensure that God's promise was fulfilled. So she interjected God's plan with a plan of her own by introducing her husband to her servant Hagar. And while doing this, Hagar and Abram produced Ishmael. So then I'll read my notes. Sarai gets impatient with God and tries to help God by informing Abram to sleep with her female servant Hagar. This action resulted in the birth of Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Now remember that. Here Abram is at 75, was promised that he would be a father of many nations. At 86, he bore his first child, but it was not the way God promised it. It was through an interjected plan of his wife. Therefore, this son is not the promise. This son is Ishmael. So let's go ahead. Genesis 17, God promises Abraham that he would be the father of a multitude of nations. There he is again, promising him again. You will be the father of many nations. Then God changed his name. Now here is where God changes his name. God changed Abram's name to Abraham. Abram means exalted father or high father. In the Hebrew, the meaning Abraham means father of multitude. So at this point, God has not only promised him, but now he's prepping him for the promise. Now, God has promised him that he's going to be the father of many nations. Now he's prepping him for it by changing his name. Now he's changed his name and now he's ready. He's ready now because now he bears the name of the father of many nations, or the father of the multitude. So, if you read further down in that 17th chapter, you'll see where God also spoke with Abram and told him to refer to his wife Sarai now as Sarah. So now he's changed Sarah's name also. So now she has gone from quarrelsome to now princess. So do you see how God is orchestrating this so that even their names line up with the word in which he has promised? Now the promise to Abraham was to be a father of many nations. So he had to change their names so that their names would be befitting of the promise that he promised them. Moving right along, he promised that he would bless Sarah and that also he would give Sarah a son. Now what was the purpose of changing Sarah's name? The purpose of changing Sarah's name was, as I stated before, to ensure that their name lined up with the promise he promised them. So now Abram's response to God in the 17th chapter, his response to God now was, now let me understand you correctly, Lord. I'm 100 years old and you're saying you're going to give me a son. My wife is 90 and you're saying that you're going to give me a son. Just as I laughed, Abraham laughed. So Abraham laughed. So then God gave him the son name. Isaac was the son name, which meant laughter. So God say, okay, so you think it's funny, so now you will name him Isaac. God is so wonderful. He has a sense of humor as well. So moving right along, as we go down to the 21st chapter of Genesis, that's when we understand that Sarah, now the promise is being fulfilled. Sarah, in the 21st chapter of Genesis, gave birth to Isaac. So get this. Sarah is 90 years old and she gives birth to Isaac. Now, his first child was born when he was 86 years old. So now there is a 14-year difference between these two children. So Ishmael is 14 years of age when Isaac is born. So Ishmael, Sarah says, you know, God has really brought laughter upon me, because many people, when they hear of this, they will laugh. Because at my age, I'm putting this in modern day conversation here. You can read the word for yourself. That's why I'm giving you the scriptures. You can read the word for yourself and get what the word is saying. But I'm putting it in modern day terms so that you can understand in conversation, so you can understand how typically you and we speak in regards to what God says or what God promises, and then when he promises, the things that we do in response. So Sarah's response to this pregnancy and to giving birth to this child is, okay, now God has blessed me with a child at the age of 90 years old. Many people will see this and laugh. So just that happened. Focus is, okay, so now there's a 14-year difference and the promise has been birthed. That's my focus. The promise there, look at this time. At 75, he was given the promise. It wasn't until 86 he received something that you might have thought was the promise, but it wasn't the promise because it was something that his wife did, not God. And God had to come back to him and speak with him again and say, I said your wife will give birth to a son, and you'll name that son Isaac. So then it was now 14 years later that he gave birth to Isaac. And now Isaac is the promise of God. So moving on to my notes, God made the request for the sacrifice. So in looking at our outline, I'll just go quickly back over what I've discussed so far. I've given you the history of Abraham. I've spoken to you about the promise of Abraham and him receiving the promise. And now where we are on the outline is Roman number 3, the sacrifice. Now let's get into that. The sacrifice requested of Abraham. Now this is just something that's just, so key, and it's something that's so important that you understand. God promised him this child at age 75, and he waited. And that's the reason why I brought up to you the 14-year difference between Ishmael and Isaac, just so you can understand that there was a huge amount of patience being exercised for this promise to come to pass. Now that the promise has come to pass, God has come back to Abraham and said, now that you have what I've promised you, now I want to test you. So how many of you understand that, God will promise you something and then he will test you on it. He'll say, now give it back, or give it away, or do away with it. In Abraham's case, this was a test, and we call it the sacrifice requested. Now, in the 22nd chapter of Genesis, you'll learn about the sacrifice. God came to Abraham and he made the request in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis, the 22nd chapter, 1 and 2. And I'll read that from the English Standard Version, and it reads, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, in these two verses, we learn that God has made a request of Abraham. And that request is that he take his son that he has waited all of these years for, his promised son. Okay, the promise from God, the one he loves dearly, the one he called laughter. He take this son and offer him up as a burnt offering. Now that's the request from God to Abraham, that he sacrifice his son as a burnt offering. Now, many may say, well, God asked for it, so I have to do what God said do. And he asked, and that's the end of it. In Abraham's case, God's request was a test. And what was it a test of? If you look at your outline, you will see it was a test of his obedience, of his faith, and of his loyalty to God. So I'll go back to the scripture and I will show you where God is testing Abraham's obedience to him, his faithfulness to him, his loyalty to him. So if you look in Genesis 22 verses 3, the next verse, it reads, "So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac." This immediately lets you know that Abraham was obedient. I mean, it does not say he hesitated. It does not say he thought about it. It just simply said he rose up, he took 2 servants and his son, and he went. So here, Abraham exercises obedience to God. Now, you will see where Abraham exercised faith, his faith in God. If you read the 5th verse, it reads, "Then Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here.'" Now, these are the servants he's talking to. "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Now, this is an example of him exercising his faith in God. Because what do we know faith to be? The Bible says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." He had no idea. He hadn't seen it visually. He just said it. So he had no idea that he would be coming back with his son, but he spoke in faith to his servants that, "My son and I, we're going to go over there and we're going to worship, but we will return." So this shows that he exercised his faith in God. If you read verse 6, you'll see again him exercising his obedience again. Now in verse 6 it says, "And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took his hand and the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together." Now this is him just doing what God told him to do. He's just being obedient right now. Now if you go back to verse 7, keep going, you'll see him exercising faith again. Now, so if you continue to read the sacrifice, you all throughout reading about the sacrifice, you get answers of the test. You get the answers. You get the answers of where he was tested in faith, where he was tested in obedience, and where he exercises faith and he exercises obedience and he exercises loyalty to God. Throughout all of this, throughout the entire chapter of the 22nd chapter of Genesis, he exercised all of these items: faith, obedience, and loyalty to God. Now reading down to 7 and 8. 7 and 8, we'll see where again he exercises his faith in God. "And Isaac said to his father Abraham, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here am I, my son.' He said, 'Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?' Abraham said, 'God will provide for him the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.' So they went both of them together." Now understand this. I know that at this point, Isaac was knowledgeable enough to understand what's required for a burnt offering. So at this point, we see that Isaac asked his father, "Father, You're gathering all of the items necessary for a burnt offering. Now, this is in modern day conversation. He's saying, Father, you're gathering all of the items necessary for a burnt offering, but where is the lamb? Where is the lamb in which you will sacrifice? Then Abraham responds to him with faith. He says, God will provide. He says, the Lord will provide the lamb. So here again, he exercises his faith in God. Moving forward down to verse 9, let's see him exercise his loyalty. Now, what is loyalty? Loyalty is a strong feeling of support or an allegiance to something. So here he is exercising his loyalty to the Lord in verse 9, where it says, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So now he's exercising his loyalty to God. He is saying, God, you have blessed me with this child. I have longed for this child. You have blessed me with this child. However, this child will not be my God. I will show you this day that I am loyal to you by letting you see me place my child on this altar. And what you have requested of me to do, I am ready and willing to do it. That's basically what Abraham is saying in his actions in verse 9. And as you continue to read, you'll see where Abraham went ahead and he did what God called him to do. Now, in our outline, I'm down to Roman numeral 4, where we speak about the ram in the bush. Now, when we get down to verse 11, you'll see how God now honors Abraham. He honors Abraham because Abraham passed the test. Abraham was requested to sacrifice his only son, his promised son. I will say that, his promised son. His promised son by God. He was asked by God to sacrifice his promised son by God. He was being tested of his obedience to God. He was being tested of his faith in God. And he was being tested of his loyalty to God. And he passed the test. And because he passed the test, God allowed a ram to be in the bush. Hence the title, every sacrifice requested may not always be required. Because God will look at your obedience. He will look at your faith in him. He will look at your loyalty to him. And he will be prompted to move on your behalf. So in this chapter, I'll read verse 10 and go right into 11, where we will understand and hear more about the ram in the bush. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, here am I. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as burnt offering instead of his son. Now here we see Abraham, he walked in faith in several instances here. He told his servants in faith that he would return with his son. He also informed his son that God is going to provide. He's going to provide a lamb. He's going to provide a sacrifice. And here, his faith was produced. That goes back to the definition of faith. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. In this chapter, we see how faith is produced. He spoke in faith in the beginning of the chapter, and toward the end of the chapter, we see how faith was manifested. His faith in God, it was manifested right before our eyes. God allowed a ram to be in the bush. And that ram, he utilized that ram as the burnt offering. Abraham called the name of that place, in which the area where he and his son were about to be, sacrificed, he called that place the Lord will provide, or we know as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. He stated with his own lips that God will provide. He will make a way. Now, let's get down to something that's really important. Now, how does this apply to my life? What has God promised you? What has God given you? What has God blessed you with that you deem very near and dear to your heart? Now, what has God asked of you? Has he asked you to make that item in which he gave to you a sacrifice? Does he ask of you to sacrifice something in which you call close to you or near and dear your heart? Every sacrifice requested is not always required by God. Oftentimes, God wants to know, are you going to be faithful to him? Are you going to love the promise so much that you forget the promiser? Or are you going to love the blessing so much that you forget the God that gave the blessing? He wants to know, are you going to hold your allegiance to him? Are you going to be loyal to him? Are you going to just be obedient to him and do what he asks of you? Are you going to be obedient, do what he asks of you, and watch him intervene? I said all of those things just to encourage you today, to let you know oftentimes the things in which you feel that God has requested of you that may be simply too hard. Maybe it's to give a certain amount of money to someone or to something, and you just don't understand how you're going to make it because that money you had planned for something else. Well, be obedient to God and watch God move. Maybe it's something close to you. Maybe it's something you find near or dear, a vehicle or a purse that you like most, or an object that you like most. Whatever it is that God has asked of you. Maybe he's asked you to sacrifice those things to test your loyalty to him, to test your obedience to him, to test your faith in him. Now, does it always mean that you will be hurt at the end and you will be without at the end? No, it doesn't. It does not. Look at Abraham. He waited a very long time for Isaac, his so-called laughter. But he knew that God had made him what he was. He knew that God had constantly promised him that son. And he knew that God would not promise him that son and then take the son away from him. But he also trusted God. He knew that God promised him that he would be a father of the multitude. Now, how is it possible for him to be a father of the multitude if the son in which he gave birth to would have to be sacrificed? except he bear another son. Now remember, his wife was in her 90s and he was 100. He just had trust and outrageous, crazy faith in God that God would not enable this son to be taken, but rather that he would provide a lamb in his stead. And that's exactly what God did. Now, what do you have faith to believe God for? Do you feel as if God has asked you to sacrifice something? Move quickly, be obedient, be swift, do what God tells you to do. That's exactly what he did. When God requested of him in verse 1 and 2, in verse 3, you saw him doing what God requested of him. He moved quickly. He did what God said, and look how God made a way. He intervened. And in intervening from him, he never even lost that in which was asked as a sacrifice. So as you continue to be obedient and do what God has called you to do what God has asked of you, and show God that this sacrifice that you're making, you will not allow this thing, whatever it may be, to be your God. You will not worship the blessings in which God bless you with, but instead you will freely give them, that God may move miraculously and bless you miraculously. And in your obedience to God, he will do just that. In my notes, I have that your obedience invoked the blessings of God, not for you alone, but also your offsprings. Quickly, I'll read 17 and 18 in this chapter. And it reads, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the shore. And your offsprings shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in your offsprings shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Look at God. Because of Abraham's obedience, his faithfulness, and his loyalty to God, God not only blessed him, but also his offsprings. Again, thank you so much for tuning in to Open Discussions for Women, my channel. I encourage you all to trust God and know that not every sacrifice requested will be required. Oftentimes, God wants to test your obedience to him, your faithfulness to him, and also your loyalty to him. So in closing, be obedient to God. Do what he asks of you, and watch the blessings of God take over your life, and not just your life, but even your children's life. Offspring is just another word for your children, your heirs, your. So I hope this has been a blessing to you all. I have done plenty of studying. I tried very hard to make this really to know that what I'm telling you is not just something that I came up with, but something that I've definitely researched and studied myself. So with that being said, you all have a blessed day, and thank you so much for joining me. Remember, not every sacrifice requested will be required. Have a good day.